Chapter 1. He was called Smith and was 12 years old, which in itself was a marvel, for it seemed as if the smallpox, the consumption, brain fever, jail fever, and even the hangman's rope had given him a wide berth for fear of catching something, or else they weren't quick enough. Smith had a turn of speed that was remarkable, and a neatness in nipping down an alley or vanishing in a court that had to be seen to be believed. Not that it was often seen, for Smith was rather a sooty spirit of the violent and ramshackle town, and inhabited the tumbled-down mazes about fat St. Paul's like the subtle air itself. A rat was like a snail beside Smith, and the most his 1,000 victims ever got of him was the powerful whiff of his passing and a cold draft in their dexterously emptied pockets. Only the sanctimonious birds that perched on the church's dome ever saw Smith's progress entire, and as their beady eyes followed him, they chattered savagely, "Pickpocket, pickpocket, jug him, jug, jug, jug him," as if they'd been appointed by the town to save it from such as Smith. His favourite spot was Ludgate Hill, where the world's coaches, chairs, and curricles were met and locked from morning to night in a horrible blasphemous confusion, and here, in one or other of the ancient doorways, he leaned and grinned, while the shouting and cursing and scraping and raging went endlessly, hopelessly on, till sooner or later something prosperous would come his way. At about 10:30 of a cold December morning, an old gentleman got furiously out of his carriage, in which he'd been trapped for an hour, shook his red fist at his helpless coachman and the roaring but motionless world, and began to stump up Ludgate Hill. "Pickpocket, pickpocket!" shrieked the cathedral birds in a fury. A country gentleman, judging by his complexion, his clean old-fashioned coat, and his broad-legged lumbering walk, which bumped out his pockets in a manner most provoking. Smith twitched his nose and nipped neatly along with it like a shadow. The old man's pace was variable. Sometimes it was brisk for his years, then he'd slow down, hesitate, look about him, as if the town had changed much since he'd last visited, and he was now no longer confident of his way. He took one turning, then another, stopped, scratched the crisp edge of his wig, then eyed the sallow, seedy city gentry as if it was to ask the way, till he spied another turn, nodded, briskly took it, and came straight back into Ludgate Hill. A dingy fellow creaked out of a doorway, like he was hinged on it, and made to accost the old man, but he did not. He'd glimpsed Smith. Looks had been exchanged, shoulders shrugged, and the old villain gave way to the young one. On went the old gentleman, confident now in his bearing, deeper and deeper into the musty, tottering forest of the town, where Smith hunted fastest and best. Now a sharpish wind sprang up, and the cathedral birds eyed the leaden sky, which looked too thick and heavy to admit them, screeched, and flew to the lower eminence of Old Bailey. Here they set up a terrific commotion with their legal brethren, till both church and law became absorbed in watching the progress of Smith. "Pickpocket, pickpocket, jug, jug, jug him!" The old gentleman was very deep in Smith's country now, and paused many a time to peer down the shambling lanes and alleys. Then he'd shake his head vaguely and touch at his coat pocket, as if a queer, deep sense had warned him of a pair of sharp eyes fairly cutting into the cloth like scissors. At least he saw something familiar, some landmark he'd remembered. Godlyman Street. Yes, he was in Godlyman Street. As suddenly as it had sprung up, the wind died, and the cathedral birds flew back to their dome. "Pickpocket, pickpocket!" The old gentleman began to stump very particularly down Godlyman Street, eyeing the old crumbly houses that were lived in by God knew how many quiet, mysterious souls, and as he went, he seemed to have two shadows, his own and another, a thin, cautious shadow that was not so much seen as sensed. This was the deepest heart of Smith's Forest, hidden even from the cathedral birds. Here the houses reared and clustered as if to shut out the sky, and so promoted the growth of the flat, pale, and unhealthy moon faces of the clerks and scriveners, glimpsed in their dark caves through dusty windows, silent and intent. Now came a slit between two very such properties, a quiet way roofed over at first floor level, Curtis Alley leading to Curtis Court. Framed by the darkness of its alley, Curtis Court presented a grey and peaceful brightness, a neglected clearing in the forest of the town, where nothing grew, and all save one of the enclosed houses had had their eyes put out with bricks on account of the tax. As the old gentleman's steps echoed in the alley, a solitary dusty raven flew up out of the court with a bitter croak. Suddenly the old gentleman gave an involuntary shudder, as if something had swiftly passed him by and made a draught. "Someone's walking over me grave," he muttered, shook his head, and entered Curtis Court. "Beg pardon, sir, beg pardon." Out of a doorway on the left of the court came Smith, which was the first time the old man had ever laid eyes on him, though all the way from Ludgate Hill there had never been more than 2 yards between them. He stopped, flustered, about 6 paces from the end of the alley. Which way was the damned urchin going? This way, that way. Angrily he shifted, and Smith, with a quaint clumsiness, brushed against him, and it was done. In an instant, Smith had emptied the old gentleman's pocket of... He halted, his eyes glittered sharply, footsteps in the alley. It would be blocked. He changed his direction as briefly as a speck in the wind, and vanished back into his doorway. But so quickly that, seconds after he disappeared, the old gentleman was still staggering and bewildered. Out of the alley came 2 men in brown. Curious fellows of very particular aspect, which Smith knew well. Uneasily he scowled, and wished he might vanish through the crumbling bricks. The old gentleman had recovered himself. He stared round angrily, till courtesy got the better of him. "Good day to ye, gentlemen," he said with an apologetic smile. The newcomers glanced quickly across the court towards the house that had kept one window, and grinned. "And good day to you!" They moved very neat and with no commotion. They were proficient in their trade. The taller came at the old man from the front. The other took on his back and slid a knife into it. The old gentleman's face was fatefully towards a certain dark doorway. He seemed to peer very anxiously around the heavy shoulder of the man who was holding him, as if for a better view. His eyes flickered with pain at the knife's quick prick. Then he looked surprised, amazed even, as he felt the cold blade slip into his warm heart. Oh my," he murmured, gave a long sigh, and died. His last sigh on this earth had been of a small, wild and despairing face, whose flooded eyes shone out of the shadows with all the dread and pity they were capable of. Smith was only 12, and hangings apart, had seen no more than 3 men murdered in all his life. They say that murdered men's eyes keep the image of their last sight for how long? Do they take it hereafter up to the seat of judgment? Smith shivered. He'd no wish for his face to be shown in any place of judgment, in this world or the next. In a terror as violent as his dislike, he watched the 2 men in brown. They were dragging the luckless old gentleman towards the darkness of the alley. Why hadn't he stayed in the country where he'd belonged? What business had he to come stumping so stupid and defenceless into Smith's secret forest? Now Smith could hear the quick fumbling sounds of searching, methodical gentry. Still no commotion. Oh, they knew what they were at. But the sounds grew harsh and hasty, even irritable. Muttered one, "Good rot, the old fool. He ain't got it." came a new sound, a very queer one, a tapping, limping, scraping sound, as one of the lame man's footsteps on the cobblestones. Then a soft, gentlemanly voice, "Well, nothing, Yana. Liars, fools, look again." Again, the sounds of searching, accompanied by strained, indrawn breath. "Told you so. Nothing." A groan, a very dreadful affair. Again, it must be there." "Well, it ain't, Yana, and if he stays much longer, we'll be on our way to join him on the end of the rope. Come on, let's be off." Again, search once more. "With respect, do it yourself, sir." "No, then we're off. Quick, there's someone coming." There was a scuffling and a scraping. Then the alley and the court were momentarily silent. A shadow crossed the broken, moss-piped paving. It was the Raven making ready to return, but Smith did not move yet. Voices and clustering footsteps could be heard coming from the far side of the alley. The pale-faced clerks and scriveners and thin-necked attorneys had caught the scent of spilt blood. They'd come out of their rooms and chambers to congregate solemnly and stare, but no one came out from the houses within the court, not even from the house with the single window. Now the crowd had grown and oozed into the court itself. The Raven flapped sourly up to a gabble and croaked with a sardonic air. Smith had invisibly joined the outskirts of the crowd, muttering away with the best of them. Then he was through, like a needle through shoddy, to Goldman Street and beyond. As he went, a door opened into the court and someone came quietly out. A quarter mile off, on the other side of St. Paul's, Smith stopped running. He sat on some steps and fumbled in his ragged ancient coat. What had he got this time? Something valuable, something that was worth more than old gentleman's life. He fished it out. A document. A document? Smith stood up, swore, spat, and cursed. For though he was quicker than a rat, sharper than a stoat, foxier than a fox, though he knew the town's corners and alleys and courts and byways better than he knew his own heart, and though he could vanish into the thick air in the twinkling of an eye, he lacked one necessary quality for the circumstance in hand. He could not read, not so much as a word. Chapter 2. Darkness came prematurely to the town, owing to the sun's habit of vanishing into the tall chimney pots of Hanover Square, where, for all Smith knew, it blazed away in the rich parlours till the time came for it to be trundled off to the Wapping and began its course anew. By 4 o'clock, the dome of St. Paul's stood black and surly against the darkening sky, and its huge shadow was flung eastward over the narrow streets and lanes of that part of the town. At last, Smith gave up his efforts to force the cramped and awkward inclines to yield up their secret, for the light was gone, and in his eyes wits and soul were aching with strain. 100 stratagems had presented themselves to him, and 100 stratagems he'd rejected. He'd thought of applying to the various scholars of his acquaintance, but which one could he trust? He'd thought of cutting the document into its various lines or even words and giving each of them to a different reader. But what if he muddled the order or lost something that proved to be vital? He walked, he sat, he tramped as far as the churchyard in Old Street, where he leaned up against a headstone, puffed at his short clay pipe, and fished out the document yet again. He stared, he screwed up his eyes and face till he looked like an old walnut. But the dim air and his own dark ignorance made the document seem like the last will and testament of a very old, very lame, very inky spider on its weary way home. So Smith likewise, with a deep sigh, packed up his thoughts and went home. Between Saffron Hill and Turnmill Street stood, or rather slouched, the Red Lion Tavern, a very evil-looking tumble-down structure, weatherboarded on 3 sides and bound on the 4th by the Great Fleet Ditch, which stank and gurgled and stank by day and night like the parlour of the tavern itself. This parlour was an ill-lit, noxious place, full of horse secrets and red-eyed morsels, not so much from all walks as from all falls of life. Thieves, pickpockets, footpads, unlucky swindlers, and ruined gamblers boozed and snoozed here and were presided over by a greasy landlord who never sold a customer to the gallows for less than a guinea. Here was Smith's home, not in the dignity of the parlour itself, but in the cellar below it where he lodged with his sisters, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny. "Not nubbed yet?" remarked the landlord humorously as Smith humped brutally in. Smith, his head full of darker things than even the Red Lion Tavern, made no answer. "I spoke to you, Smith." "Did you now? I thought it was a belch from the old ditch." 2 or 3 customers grinned, and Smith dodged deftly past the landlord to the cellar steps, but was not quite quick enough to miss a fist on his ear. He howled and vanished, and the landlord laughed fit to burst. "Got him that time." "You asked for it, you brought it on yourself," remarked Miss Bridget, looking up from stitching a brown velveteen coat. "Poor little smut," murmured Miss Fanny over a pair of grey breeches. "One day he'll come down them steps stone dead." "I'm not complaining," said Smith, rubbing his ear, which, had it been clean, would have been red as a strawberry, but instead was now a warm black. "Saw an old gent done in today." "Indeed? And what's that to do with abusing the landlord?" "Me mind was on other things. 'Tis no excuse. We brung you up to be genteel, Fanny, and me just feels the disgrace." "Put a dab of vinegar on your little lug, smut," said Miss Fanny. "'Twill take out the sting." The mentioned vinegar, as there was a quantity of it in the cellar, for the sisters engaged as in scouring and cleaning, besides making gentle alterations to cast off clothing from unfortunates who were hanged and so never had a chance to wear their last garments out. The velveteen coat and the grey breeches were bespoken by the hangman himself, for they'd come off a very high-stepping rogue indeed, and one everybody was sorry to see nubbed. "But the law must take its course," had said Miss Bridget, and "'tis an ill wind," had said Miss Fanny, when Smith brought the garments in. "Look what I got this time," said Smith, after he'd wiped his ear with vinegar. He fished out the document and spread it on the table, full in the light of the tallows. Just before he was done in, not a quarter of a minute, the Smith family stared at the document. None of them could read. "What is it?" asked Miss Fanny. "'Twas what he was killed for," said Smith, and went on to relate all the circumstances of the crime, not forgetting the unseen man with the limp, and the thought of whom terrified him more than anything else. "It's a deed to property," declared Miss Bridget, "for that queer thing." She jabbed her needle at a piece of writing. "That looks so like a horse and cart is the word property." "Indeed it is. I'd know it anywhere." Smith was not convinced. Then why was he done in for it, and why was they so frantic when they couldn't find it? Poor old fool. "Reasons," said Miss Bridget darkly in return to the velveteen coat. "Reasons." "I think," said Miss Fanny, "that it's a confession or an accusation, for that's the sort of thing a murder's done for, accepting money, and it ain't money. Now, though I don't quarrel with Brid's property, for I believe her to be right, there's a whereas most distinct, and that piece like a nest of maggots there," she pricked with her needle, "I know to be felonious. "Oh yes, indeed, smut dear, you got a confession which will be very valuable if we can only find out what's been done. For if they was willing to and able to kill for it, well, they'll be equally willing to pay for it. Clever smut." Smith frowned, still not convinced, but inclined more to a confession than a property deed. In his heart of hearts he thought the document might be something else altogether, but said nothing, having nothing to go on, nor any piece of knowledge to contradict his sisters with. "So he must get it read out to us," continued Miss Fanny, neglecting the breeches, "so we can know where to apply." "And who, miss, would you ask?" queried Miss Bridget irritably. "Lord Tom can read," said Smith, thinking of his highwayman idol and friend. Lord Tom, repeated Miss Fanny, blushing and smiling. The very scholar. Miss Bridget sneered. That high Toby is so much in his cups, his mouth's grown like a spout. Mark my words, miss, I'd as soon trust him with anything worth money as I'd trust the landlord. Not that I think the paper's worth money at all, for it's neither more nor less than a deed to property. They went on arguing thus till the tallows burned low, with Miss Bridget inclining more and more to property, and Miss Fanny, who was softer and younger, being scarce 19, keeping to the romantic notion of a confession on whose value as blackmail they might all live happily ever after. But on one thing they all agreed, the difficulty of finding anyone they could trust enough to read it to them. At length, when the room was full of tallow, smoke, and shifting shadows, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny retired to their curtained-off bedroom, and Smith to his corner in the workroom itself. For some minutes one tallow remained alight, and afforded Smith a sombre view of the brown velveteen coat and the grey breeches bespoken by the hangman. They were upon a hook in a corner and presented a disagreeable resemblance to their aspect when their last owner had worn them. Smith wondered if he was likely to come back for them. Fearfully white and moaning about the cold. Well, they'd not fit him now. He screwed up his face scornfully at the thought of ghosts, but continued to stare into dark corners till he fell asleep, and when he awoke did so with a startled air and looked about him with some relief to see the old brick and plaster walls and the dim grey daylight falling down the cellar steps, as if his dreams had given him cause to doubt his firm belief in no ghosts. The document was still on the table. He folded it up and began to tiptoe towards the stairs. "Where are you off to, smut dear?" Miss Fanny, much tousled and creased, had poked her head through the curtain. "Newgate," said Smith briefly. "Got business." "What are you going to do with our document, smut?" "Don't know yet. Wouldn't it be safer here?" "Why?" "Well, dear, if them that wanted it did it in an old man for it, they won't think twice about doing it in a boy. Don't know I got it. Never saw me. There's only you and Miss Bridget what knows." "Oh, yes, that's true. But you never can tell, smut. Someone may have seen you. Won't you leave it behind?" "No." "Are you going to show it to Lord Tom?" "Dunno. Maybe." "If he's going to Newgate," came Miss Bridget's voice, still croaked with sleep, "tell him to screw some money out of that Mr. Jones, for there'll not be another stitch done till there's something on the account. Hangman is horrible customers, so degrading." Miss Fanny's head, which had vanished from the moment, reappeared. "Mr. Jones, smut, Brid says. See Mr. Jones?" Then she sighed. "For the last time, dear, leave the document behind. 'Twill be safe as houses." "Oh, smut, I've an horrible feeling you was seen and are in danger." "Oh, smut, I fear you'll be coming down the steps tonight, stone dead." Chapter 3. A tremendous idea had lodged in Smith's mind and, like all truly great things, answered its purpose so exactly that one exclaimed, "Why hadn't it been thought of before? He would learn how to read!" The morning was dull and windy. The cathedral birds were huddled upon Old Bailey, which stood to the leeward side of the stench from Newgate Jail. Such merchants and clerks and attorneys who walked the whipping streets kept their heads down and their hands to their wigs and hats, as if to hold their aspiring thoughts from flying out to become common property. A general frown and scowl creased their faces. Another day was bad enough, without the insolent wind aggravating it. Smith had spread the document inside his coat and across his chest, where it kept him from the worst of the weather. "Be still, old fellow," he muttered from time to time, as if the stiff paper prickled and tickled. "You and me's got business. You and me's going up in the world, just as soon as I gets you to talk." He was crossing Ludgate Hill when suddenly he fancied he saw the murdered old gentleman stumping along ahead of him. He stopped, much frightened. Then he looked again and saw that the old gentleman was someone else altogether. But thereafter the murdered man stayed pretty firmly in his thoughts, as if keeping a watch on his document and where Smith was taking it, which in the first place was to the blackened and gloomy felonage of Newgate Jail. Smith turned in at the lodge, greeted the jailer there, and lit up his battered pipe against the dreadful smells to come. First, he thought he found out Mr. Jones, the hangman, a short, stout, horny-handed gent who shone with pomatum. He got 3 shillings out of him on account, together with a surly prophecy that if he, Smith, didn't mind his P's and Q's, he'd become Mr. Jones' customer in a transaction with a yardage of hemp. P's and Q's, said Smith earnestly. Them's letters, ain't they? Mr. Jones agreed. Then show us a P, Mr. Jones, and then show us a Q, and I'll try to mind 'em. For the thought had occurred to Smith that 2 letters would be a fair start to the day's work of learning to read. Unluckily, Mr. Jones took him for a humorist and aimed a thump that would have been pleasurable if it had struck. Bleeding scholars, thought Smith as he scuttled out of the hangman's office, want to keep everything to themselves. From Mr. Jones it was but a brief, though dark and sullen, way down a ragged stairway, along a passage, a turn to the right, then up 2 steps to the stone hall, where Smith's present hopes were most likely to be passing the time of what was neither night nor day. The stone hall was a long, low, arched room with its own stone sky and its own 6 lanterns for a sun. When these were lit, it was day. When they were out, it was night, no matter what the outside heavens were declaring. Smith's present hopes shuffled somewhere among the lost multitude of town's rubbish and dregs, grumbling ragbags and tattered felons, debtors who always looked surprised, and here and there, like a fallen moon, a pale white face of unbroken pride, most likely of a man due to being hanged. Here was Smith's place of daily business, for he ran errands for the debtors, 2 pence a mile dry and a 4 pence when it rained. Very educated gentlemen, the debtors. A man needs to be educated to get into debt. Scholars all. The first Smith tried was a tall, fine-looking gentleman who, though still in leg irons, walked like he owned the jail. As well he might, for his debts couldn't have bought it entire. He smiled. He was never at a loss for a smile, which was perhaps why he was there. When a man can't pay what he owes, a smile is a deal worse than nothing. Learn us to read, mister, said Smith humbly. The fine debtor stopped and looked and sighed. Not in 10,000 years, my boy. And before Smith could ask him why, he told him, be happy that you can't, for what will you get by it? You'll read and fret over disasters that might never touch you. You'll read hurtful letters that might have passed you by. You'll read warrants and summonses where you might have pleaded ignorance. You'll read of bills overdue and creditors' anger where you might have ignored it for all another month. Don't learn to read, Smith. Oh, I implore you. Then the gentleman drifted, smiling away with his back straight, his head held high, and his ankles jingling. Next, Smith applied to a learned felon, a ferret-faced man with a small starry eyes. What d'ye want to read for, Smith? No need, and if it weren't for me skill as a reader, I'd not be here today. I was on the run and saw a new goldsmith sign, stopped to read it, and here I am. No, stay ignorant, me boy, and keep out of harm's way. Smith pleaded, but the felon was determined, so Smith left him and would have gone from Stone Hall had he not seen Mr. Palmer. This Mr. Palmer was a debtor of a different sort, a gentle, sad man who could not bring himself to believe that the world had been so spiteful as to jail him, even though it had been these past 5 years. For Mr. Palmer, did the world but know it, nourished a very high opinion of himself, which he was careful to hide for fear of it being damaged. Learn us to read, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer stopped in mid-shuffle. Learn us to read, Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer turned on Smith a look of amazement that hid a powerful contempt and dislike, even loathing, for his debtor loathed, hated, and despised every mortal thing that was better off than himself by being free. "A pleasure to learn you, Smith," he said. "Here, boy." He bent down and beckoned. Smith approached. "This is how we begin." He seized Smith's nose as hard as he could and pulled and twisted and wrenched it until Smith's squeals filled the stone hall and his eyes fairly gushed with tears. Then his own voice was raised even louder in a fearful bellow of pain. He'd forgotten Smith wore no leg irons and could use his feet to advantage. In an instant, Smith was fled, leaving Mr. Palmer with an empty finger and thumb and a pair of shins that splintered with booting. He lay on the ground and continued to roar, only breaking off to pray that the ungrateful brat who'd crippled him might come to a bad end on Mr. Jones' rope, while Smith, full of anger and humiliation and burning pain in his nose, left Newgate Jail swearing a solemn oath that not till he was took would he ever set foot in that foul place again. With his hands pressed to his chest and his eyes still streaming with forced tears, he ran towards the nestling of lanes about the great cathedral. Soft-hearted ladies stared as he passed, moved by the sight of the weeping urchin. Then his eyes dried up, his nose recovered, and his grand determination flared anew. He would learn to read, for he and the document were going up against the world, though the devil himself stood against them. Surely the town had more scholars than those in Newgate Jail. The streets must be full of them. He'd only to ask, no harm in asking. He crossed the windy street to meet with a round-faced old gentleman with an absent-minded air. Mister, learn me to read." The gentleman paused, momentarily taking his hand from his hat. In an instant the wind whipped it off, together with his wig, leaving him as bald as the dome of St. Paul's. Smith, meaning no offence, began to grin. The gentleman raised his stick, and Smith fled for his life. He asked a lawyer, a clerk, a country schoolmaster, but they'd have none of him. He poked his head through the window of a carriage waiting outside an apothecary's to ask if the elderly lady sat within. But she shrieked and shouted to her footman to frighten him off. At last he found himself in Holborn Hill, passing by grey, high-shouldered St. Andrew's Church. The church, mother of the town, and all creatures in it. With renewed hope he shuffled up to the porch and peered into the richly stained gloom of the church's insides. Blood of glass martyrs fell across the aisle and drenched the altar, and there was a smell of damp stone in the quiet air, a very peaceful, gentle sort of place. At first, it seemed empty, and Smith had some brief thoughts concerning the candlesticks. "What do you want, my child?" A priest was in the pulpit, still as a carven saint. "Oh, it's beautiful," said Smith ingratiatingly. I don't know what that word is. "Just like me sister's stories of heaven." The priest nodded and smiled kindly. "What are you looking at for, my child?" "Guidance, your reverence," said Smith, who decided this time to ask roundabout. "Are you lost?" "Oh, no, your worship. This is Holborn Hill." The priest compressed his lips and eyed Smith shrewdly. Hurriedly, Smith went on. "Learn me to read, your holiness. That's what I come for. Learn me to read so's I can read the Holy Scripture." The priest stared in amazement at the filthy, strong-smelling little creature who stood in the aisle with his black hands pressed to his grubby heart. "If you come and stand by the door during the service, then you'll hear me reading from the Holy Scripture, child. Won't that be a comfort and help?" "Oh, yes, your grace, and I'm humbly obliged. But what of when I'm home, all in dirt and disorder? Who'll read to me then? And me two poor sisters, a panting, a groaning, a supplicating for salvation? Who'll read to them? Oh, no, your reverence, I got to learn to read so's I can comfort myself in the dark o' the night, and light a little lamp in me sisters' souls with perusings along from the good book." But this was too much. "You're a little liar!" exclaimed the priest abruptly. Smith gazed thoughtfully up at him, proud in his white surplice and bands. "And you're a fat bag of rotting flour," he snarled suddenly. "I hope the weevils get ya." Was there no one in all town who'd teach Smith to read? He passed the top of Godalming Street. A man came out of somewhere, stopped and stared at him palely, but Smith, still disheartened by the church's rejection, did not see him and went wearily on. Smith came to the booksellers in St. Paul's churchyard, a last hope for the day, and where better to learn to read than in a bookshop. Several times he idled up and down, and judging his chances in each shop. Here a proprietor scowled at him, there a clerk shook his fist, and there an entrance was blocked by a fat man who seemed to have died in the act of reading, but came to life to turn a page and acknowledge the helpless bookseller with a corpse-like nod. And there was one shop that attracted Smith by the mad profusion and tottery architecture of its wares. Books stood in walls and towers and battlements as if the owner had been in a state of siege for 100 years, which was partly borne out of it by his appearance. He was an amazingly thin, wary little man, with a nervous affliction which made his head dart from side to side as if he wondering from where the attack might come. Nor was he put at ease when he saw Smith, for he'd seen Smith before, even knew him. He sat in a curious kind of cave of books where he could jerk and twitch in privacy and quiet. "Learn us to read, mister. Be off with you," he said curtly, jerking his head to the right. "Ain't you got no feelings for your trade?" asked Smith earnestly. "Don't you want it to prosper with more readers?" "You're a wicked little thief," said the bookseller, now jerking to the left. "Only because I'm ignorant. Get out of here. Why won't you learn me? Keep your thieving hands to yourself. Why won't anybody learn me?" "Because they've too much sense. All this goodness and wisdom and learning." Smith was grandly pointing to the dusty cliffs and reared on either side. "Touch a book and I'll finish you." The bookseller was now jerking and twitching pretty vigorously, and as his head flew from side to side, Smith considerately tried to keep pace with it, which made him appear as if he was performing a wild dance. "Keep still," shouted the bookseller of a sudden, and jerked worse than ever. Too late. Smith, capering wider and wider, struck first again. The calamity that followed, though of brief duration, was terrific in its scope. It was as if the long siege was at last over and the enemy had breached all the walls at once. The 2 walls of shelves had collapsed, and with them brought down in a mighty and thunderous torrent every last item in the whole of the ramshackle shop. Books in their fluttering and dusty thousands poured and thumped down as if the very skies had been loaded with them. Histories, memoirs, diaries, lexicons, grammars, atlases, journals, biographies, poems, plays, books about heaven, books about hell, huge books about pygmies, tiny books about giants, even books about books, all slid and tumbled into a desperate ruin overhung by a bitter cloud of dust. And somewhere underneath it all, still jerking and twitching, though feebly now, lay the unlucky bookseller himself. "Oh no," thought Smith, halfway round the cathedral and going like the wind. "He must be squashed flatter than an old sixpence." But the bookseller was alive, and while Smith was still running and wondering hopelessly whom next he could ask to teach him to read, his last victim was being exhumed by neighbours and passers-by. Strangely enough, he seemed almost the better for the disaster, as though all his life he'd expected and dreaded it, and now that it had happened, a load was fallen from his soul. He jerked and twitched hardly at all as he told how it had come about and who'd been chiefly to blame. "They call him Smith," he said, "and where does he come from? Somewhere near the ditch. I fancy it's the Red Lion Tavern." The questioner had been a passer-by, the man who'd earlier come out of Godalming Street.